December 3, 1944. A field hospital 12 miles behind the front lines near Hürtgen Forest, Germany. The air inside the medical tent smelled of iodine, blood, and wet canvas. Outside, rain fell steadily on frozen ground. Inside, 27 wounded men lay on cots arranged in 2 rows. Most were quiet. Some groaned. A few slept fitfully under thin wool blankets. At 14:20, an ambulance arrived carrying casualties from the 22nd Infantry Regiment. For men, 3 with shrapnel wounds. 1 with no visible injuries. The medical staff worked quickly. Triage was standard procedure. Assess, prioritize, treat. The first 3 soldiers were bleeding. They received immediate attention. The 4th soldier was placed on a cot near the rear of the tent to wait for evaluation. His name was Private First Class Robert Samuel Morrison, 22 years old. Born in Columbus, Ohio. Drafted 18 months earlier. Trained at Fort Benning, Georgia. Shipped to Europe in July 1944. Assigned to Company B, 22nd Infantry Regiment, 4th Infantry Division. 5 months of continuous combat. Normandy, Paris, the Ardennes. He had survived all of it. His uniform was caked with mud. His hands trembled slightly. His face was pale. But he had no wounds. At 14:45, Captain David Weiss approached Morrison's cot. Weiss was the battalion surgeon. 41 years old. Civilian physician before the war. General practitioner from Pittsburgh. He had been treating combat casualties for 16 months. He had seen thousands of wounded men. He could recognize patterns. Morrison did not fit the usual pattern. No blood. No bandages. No obvious trauma. Weiss asked Morrison what happened. Morrison did not answer immediately. He stared at the canvas ceiling of the tent. His jaw was tight. His breathing was shallow. Then without warning he began to laugh. It was not a brief chuckle. It was sustained laughter that lasted 12 seconds. Loud enough that other patients turned to look. Morrison's body shook with the force of it. His eyes remained wide open. The laughter had no humor in it. It sounded mechanical. Forced. Wrong. Weiss waited for Morrison to stop. When the laughter ended, Morrison's expression did not change. He looked exhausted. Frightened. Weiss asked again what happened. Morrison opened his mouth to speak. Instead he laughed again. This time for 15 seconds. Weiss had seen combat fatigue before. He had treated soldiers who could not stop trembling. Soldiers who could not sleep. Soldiers who jumped at sudden sounds. But he had never seen a soldier who could not stop laughing. Morrison had been in the Hürtgen Forest for 17 days. His company had entered the forest on November 16 with 187 men. By December 3, 94 remained. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. The Hürtgen Forest was 50 square miles of dense evergreen trees, steep ravines, and German bunkers. American forces had been trying to take the forest since September. Progress was measured in yards. Casualties were measured in thousands. Morrison's platoon had been assigned to clear a section of forest near the village of Wassenach. The trees grew so close together that tanks could not maneuver. Artillery support was limited because shells exploded in the tree canopy before reaching the ground. Air support was impossible. The forest was too dense. Soldiers fought at close range. 20 yards. 10 yards. Sometimes 5. They could hear German soldiers talking. They could smell their cigarette smoke. But they could rarely see them through the trees. The psychological strain was immense. Men spent days in wet foxholes surrounded by darkness and the constant threat of death. They ate cold rations. They could not light fires because the smoke would reveal their positions. They relieved themselves in the foxholes because moving above ground meant exposure to enemy fire. The smell of death was everywhere. Bodies lay in the underbrush. American. German. Sometimes impossible to identify because of the state of decomposition. Morrison had been a good soldier. His company commander, Captain James Hartley, later wrote that Morrison had performed well under pressure. He followed orders. He did not panic. He helped wounded comrades. He shared rations. He kept his rifle clean even in the mud and rain. But something happened on December 2 that broke him. The exact sequence of events was difficult to reconstruct because Morrison could not speak without laughing. What is known came from other soldiers in his platoon. On December 2 at approximately 8:30, Morrison's squad was ordered to advance toward a German machine gun position. The position was in a concrete bunker 50 yards ahead. The squad consisted of 12 men. They moved forward through the trees in a loose formation. The ground was slippery from rain. Visibility was poor. At 8:45 the German machine gun opened fire. The first burst killed Corporal Thomas Wright instantly. The second burst wounded Private Eugene Davis in the chest. The remaining soldiers dove for cover behind trees and fallen logs. Morrison ended up in a shallow depression 30 yards from the bunker. He was alone. The rest of his squad was scattered behind him. For the next 4 hours, Morrison lay in that depression while the machine gun fired periodically at any movement. He could not advance. He could not retreat without exposing himself. He could hear Davis screaming for a medic. The screaming lasted 20 minutes. Then it stopped. Morrison knew what that meant. He waited. The rain continued. His uniform was soaked through. Water pooled in the depression around him. He began to shiver. Not from cold. From fear. At 12:50, American artillery began a bombardment of the German position. The shells exploded in the trees above the bunker. Shrapnel fell like rain. Morrison pressed himself flat against the ground. The bombardment lasted 8 minutes. When it ended, Morrison heard German voices. They were calling for help. Someone was wounded. Morrison did not move. He waited to see if the machine gun was still operational. At 13:15, Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien called for Morrison to fall back. The squad was withdrawing. The artillery had not destroyed the bunker. Morrison began to crawl backward through the mud. He moved slowly. Every movement felt exposed. He expected bullets. They did not come. He reached the rest of his squad 30 yards behind. O'Brien ordered everyone back to the company position. They retreated through the forest. Morrison walked in silence. Other soldiers talked quietly about Wright and Davis. Morrison said nothing. They reached the company position at 1400 hours. O'Brien reported the failed advance to Captain Hartley. Morrison sat down on a log. Then he started laughing. Loud. Sustained. The other soldiers stared. O'Brien asked Morrison what was funny. Morrison did not answer. He kept laughing. It lasted almost a minute. When it stopped, Morrison looked terrified. He tried to speak. The laughter came back. Hartley ordered Morrison evacuated. 2 soldiers helped him walk to the battalion aid station half a mile behind the lines. Morrison laughed the entire way. The battalion surgeon examined him briefly, found no physical injuries, and sent him to the field hospital for psychiatric evaluation. That was how Morrison ended up in Captain Weiss's tent. Laughing uncontrollably. Unable to explain what happened. Unable to stop. Captain Weiss had limited psychiatric training. Medical school included a 6-week rotation in a psychiatric ward. That was 12 years earlier. He remembered the basics. Mental illness could manifest in many forms. Depression. Anxiety. Psychosis. But uncontrollable laughter was unusual. Weiss decided to observe Morrison for several hours before making a diagnosis. He assigned Morrison a cot in a quiet corner of the tent away from other patients. He instructed the nurses to monitor Morrison's behavior. Over the next 3 hours, Morrison laughed 17 times. The episodes varied in duration. Some lasted only a few seconds. Others continued for more than a minute. There was no obvious trigger. Morrison would be sitting quietly, staring at nothing, and then the laughter would begin. His body would shake. Tears would stream down his face. But his expression remained blank. When the laughter stopped, he would gasp for breath. His hands would tremble. Then he would sit still again until the next episode. At 1800 hours, Weiss attempted another interview. He sat beside Morrison's cot and spoke quietly. He asked Morrison his name. Morrison opened his mouth to respond. Laughter came out instead. Weiss waited. The laughter lasted 23 seconds. When it ended, Morrison whispered, "I'm sorry." Then he laughed again. This pattern repeated 4 times. Morrison would try to speak. Laughter would interrupt. He would apologize. More laughter would follow. Weiss asked yes or no questions. Could Morrison nod or shake his head to answer? Morrison nodded. Progress. Weiss asked if Morrison remembered what happened in the forest. Morrison nodded. Weiss asked if something specific triggered the laughter. Morrison shook his head. Weiss asked if Morrison wanted the laughter to stop. Morrison nodded vigorously. Tears formed in his eyes. Not from laughter. From desperation. The other patients in the tent began to notice. Some found Morrison's laughter disturbing. One soldier, recovering from a leg wound, asked the nurses to move Morrison somewhere else. The laughter was keeping him awake, making him nervous. A corporal with a chest wound said it was bad luck. Said Morrison was cursed. Said cursed men brought death. The nurses told both soldiers to be quiet. But the unease was spreading. At 20:30, Morrison's laughter woke 3 sleeping patients. One sat up and shouted at Morrison to shut up. Morrison tried to comply. He pressed his hands over his mouth. The laughter continued. Muffled but still audible. His shoulders shook. His eyes were wide with panic. He could not control it. Weiss ordered Morrison moved to a separate tent. The tent was normally used for storage. Medical supplies. Extra cots. It was cold. But it was isolated. Morrison would not disturb other patients there. 2 orderlies helped Morrison walk to the storage tent. He laughed during the entire transfer. Inside the tent, they set up a cot, provided blankets, left a lantern burning. Morrison sat on the cot. The orderlies left. He was alone. The laughter continued. In the silence of the empty tent, it echoed off the canvas walls. Morrison covered his face with his hands. His body shook. This was his prison now. Isolated. Trapped inside his own mind. Unable to speak. Unable to stop laughing. By December 4th, Morrison's condition had not improved. Weiss consulted with Major Harold Fisher, the division psychiatrist. Fisher was stationed at a larger hospital 20 miles to the rear. He traveled to Weiss's field hospital that afternoon to evaluate Morrison. Fisher was 48 years old, trained psychoanalyst, civilian practice in New York before the war. He had been working with combat fatigue cases since the North Africa campaign in 1943. He had treated hundreds of soldiers. But he had never encountered a case like Morrison's. Fisher spent 2 hours with Morrison in the storage tent. He attempted various therapeutic approaches. He asked Morrison to describe the traumatic event in writing. Morrison wrote 3 sentences before dropping the pencil and laughing for 40 seconds. Fisher asked Morrison to draw what he remembered. Morrison drew a crude sketch of trees in a bunker. Then he laughed. Fisher tried hypnosis. He used standard induction techniques. Morrison appeared to enter a trance state. Fisher asked questions about December 2nd. Morrison's eyes opened. He laughed. The trance broke. Fisher concluded that Morrison was suffering from acute combat fatigue with a rare symptom presentation. The medical term was pathological laughter. It was documented in psychiatric literature but extremely uncommon. Fisher had read about it. He had never seen it. The condition occurred when extreme psychological trauma damaged the brain's emotional regulation system. The laughter was involuntary. A neurological misfire. The patient's conscious mind wanted to stop, but the unconscious mind, overwhelmed by trauma, had short-circuited. Treatment options were limited. Rest. Medication. Tom. Fisher prescribed sodium amytal, a barbiturate used to treat anxiety. The drug was supposed to calm the nervous system, reduce involuntary responses. Fisher administered the first dose at 1600 hours. Morrison fell asleep within 30 minutes. He slept for 4 hours. When he woke at 20:30 he seemed calmer. Weiss asked how he felt. Morrison opened his mouth to answer. The laughter returned, stronger than before, lasting 90 seconds. The medication had not worked. December 5th. Morrison's laughter continued throughout the night. The guards stationed outside the storage tent could hear it. They found it unsettling. One guard, Private Kenneth Barnes, later said it sounded like Morrison was being tortured. Barnes had been in combat. He had heard men screaming from wounds. But the laughter was worse. It sounded inhuman. By morning Barnes requested reassignment. He did not want to guard that tent anymore. Morrison stopped eating on December 6th. When nurses brought food he would try to eat. The first bite would trigger laughter. Food would fall from his mouth. He would gag. More laughter. The nurses tried liquid meals. Same result. Fisher became concerned. Morrison was losing weight. His body was weakening. If the laughter continued, Morrison might die. Not from the condition itself, but from exhaustion and starvation. Fisher decided to try a more aggressive treatment. Electroshock therapy. The procedure was controversial. Many doctors considered it barbaric. But Fisher had seen it work on severe cases of combat fatigue. The theory was that electrical current could reset malfunctioning brain circuits, disrupt pathological patterns, allow normal function to return. The procedure was painful, frightening. But Fisher saw no alternative. Morrison was deteriorating. Something had to be done. On December 7th, Morrison was transferred to the 67th Evacuation Hospital near Liège, Belgium. The facility had equipment for electroshock therapy. Morrison laughed during the entire ambulance ride. 2 hours. Non-stop. The medic accompanying him, Corporal James Sullivan, later wrote to his family about the experience. He said Morrison's laughter was the most disturbing sound he had ever heard. Said it made him question whether some men could be broken beyond repair. At the evacuation hospital, Morrison was admitted to the psychiatric ward. There were 42 other patients, all suffering from combat fatigue. Some had the shakes. Some had nightmares. Some had lost the ability to speak. But Morrison was the only one who laughed. The other patients avoided him. They believed he was insane. Beyond help. A reminder of what could happen to any of them if they were pushed too far. Dr. Elizabeth Chun was assigned to Morrison's case. She was 34 years old. Captain in the Army Nurse Corps. Psychiatric nurse. Before the war, she worked at a state psychiatric hospital in California. She had extensive experience with severe mental illness. But Morrison's condition was unlike anything in her training. She reviewed his medical file. Reviewed Fisher's notes. Consulted psychiatric textbooks. Nothing prepared her for what she witnessed. Morrison's laughter had evolved. By December 8th the episodes were longer. More intense. His face would turn red from lack of oxygen. His body would convulse. After each episode he would collapse on the bed, gasping, exhausted. Then after a few minutes of rest the cycle would repeat. Chin estimated Morrison was laughing approximately 40% of his waking hours. He slept only in brief intervals. Never more than 30 minutes at a time. The laughter would wake him. The first electroshock treatment was administered on December 9th. Morrison was brought to the treatment room at 10 o'clock. Chin explained the procedure. Morrison tried to ask questions. Laughter interrupted. Chin placed a rubber guard in Morrison's mouth to prevent him from biting his tongue. She applied electrode pads to his temples. She administered a mild sedative. Then she activated the device. Electrical current passed through Morrison's brain for 3 seconds. His body went rigid. The muscles contracted involuntarily. The treatment ended. Morrison was unconscious. He woke 30 minutes later in the recovery room. Chin was beside him. She asked how he felt. Morrison looked at her. For the first time in 7 days he did not laugh. He whispered, "Tired." One word. No laughter. Chin felt a surge of hope. Maybe the treatment had worked. But 10 minutes later Morrison laughed again. A short burst. 5 seconds. Then silence. Then another laugh. The pattern was resuming. Chin administered a second treatment on December 11th. Same procedure. Same result. Morrison would have a brief period of control after waking. Then the laughter would return. Gradually at first. Then with full intensity. By December 13th, Chin had given Morrison 4 treatments. None provided lasting improvement. The laughter persisted. Morrison was losing hope. So was Chin. By December 15, 1944, Morrison had lost 19 pounds. His cheeks were hollow. His eyes were sunken. He looked like a man dying slowly. The laughter was consuming him. Burning energy he could not replace. He ate small amounts when forced. But most meals ended in choking fits followed by more laughter. His body was failing. Chin contacted Major Fisher. She explained the situation. The electroshock treatments were not working. Morrison was deteriorating. Fisher reviewed the case file again. He consulted with colleagues at other hospitals. No one had a solution. Pathological laughter was too rare. Too poorly understood. Medical science had no cure. The only option was to keep Morrison sedated. Keep him alive. Hope the condition resolved on its own. Hope his mind could heal with time. Morrison was placed on a regimen of heavy sedation. Sodium pentothal. Administered 3 times daily. The drug kept him in a semi-conscious state. He slept most of the day. When awake he was groggy. Confused. But the laughter was reduced. Not eliminated. Just less frequent. Less intense. It was not a cure. It was management. Keeping Morrison alive while his brain tried to repair itself. The psychiatric ward became Morrison's world. He spent Christmas 1944 in a hospital bed, sedated, occasionally laughing, mostly sleeping. He had no visitors. His family did not know where he was. Mail was slow. The army had informed Morrison's parents that he was hospitalized. But the letter provided no details. Just said he was receiving treatment for a non-combat injury. His mother, Helen Morrison, wrote letters asking for more information. She received no reply. Other soldiers in the psychiatric ward watched Morrison with mixed feelings. Some felt sympathy. They understood that combat could break anyone. They had witnessed friends collapse under the pressure. They knew Morrison was not weak. He was wounded. Just not in a way that showed on the outside. But others felt disgust. They believed Morrison should have been stronger. Should have controlled himself. They whispered that he was faking. Using the laughter to escape the war. Malingering. Getting a free ride home while real men fought. The stigma of psychiatric casualties was pervasive. The Army officially recognized combat fatigue as a legitimate medical condition. But many officers and enlisted men did not. They saw it as cowardice disguised as illness. A failure of character. Not a failure of the nervous system. This attitude permeated military culture. It created an environment where wounded soldiers felt ashamed to seek help. Where men like Morrison were judged rather than supported. Morrison's company commander, Captain Hartley, wrote a letter to the hospital on December 28. He asked about Morrison's condition. He said Morrison had been a good soldier. Reliable. Brave. He hoped Morrison would recover. But Hartley also wrote something else. He said the other men in the company were asking questions. They wanted to know if Morrison was coming back. They wanted to know if he was faking. Hartley did not accuse Morrison directly. But the letter revealed the doubt. The suspicion. The unspoken judgment. Chin read Hartley's letter. She felt anger. She had watched Morrison suffer for weeks. She had seen him try desperately to control the laughter. She had seen the terror in his eyes. There was nothing fake about Morrison's condition. But she could not prove it. Could not point to a visible wound. Could not show an X-ray. The damage was invisible. Located somewhere in the complex neural pathways of Morrison's brain. Real. But unseen. By January 15, 1945, Morrison showed slight improvement. The episodes of laughter were less frequent. Perhaps 3 or 4 times per day instead of dozens. The sedation was gradually reduced. Morrison began to regain some awareness. Some control. He could eat without choking. He could sleep for several hours without waking. But he still could not speak more than a few words without laughing. And those few words were always the same. "I'm sorry." Chin began gentle rehabilitation. She asked Morrison to perform simple tasks. Write his name. Draw shapes. These activities helped rebuild neural connections, helped Morrison regain control over voluntary movements. Slowly, painfully, Morrison's brain was rewiring itself, finding new pathways around the damaged areas. It was like teaching someone to walk after a stroke. Progress was measured in tiny increments. A sentence spoken without laughter. An hour without an episode. These were victories. But the psychological damage ran deeper than the laughter. When Morrison was lucid, he talked to Chin. He said he could not stop thinking about December 2nd. The depression. The machine gun. Wright dying. Davis screaming. The 4 hours of waiting. He said those 4 hours played in his mind constantly. The loop. He could not escape it. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in that hole. Wet. Cold. Terrified. Waiting to die. This was the true nature of combat fatigue. Not simply fear. Not simple stress. It was the psychological shattering that occurred when a human being was exposed to sustained, inescapable mortal threat. The mind could only tolerate so much. When the stress exceeded the breaking point, the mind fractured. Some fractures healed cleanly. Others left permanent scars. Morrison's fracture had manifested as pathological laughter. But beneath the symptom was a deeper injury. A wound to the core of who Morrison had been. Chin asked Morrison what he wanted. He said he wanted to go home. He said he could not go back to the war. Could not face the forest again. Could not hear machine guns without feeling the terror return. He knew this made him a coward. He believed this. Chin told him he was not a coward. He was wounded. But Morrison did not believe her. He had internalized the military's judgment. He believed his mind's failure was a moral failure. On February 1st, Morrison was transferred to a psychiatric hospital in England. The 95th General Hospital near Winchester. The facility specialized in treating severe combat fatigue cases. Morrison would receive extended care there. Possibly months. The goal was to stabilize his condition enough that he could function. Not return to combat. Just function. Hold a job. Live independently. Not be a burden to his family. The hospital had 400 beds. All filled. The psychiatric ward had 120 patients. All combat fatigue cases. Some had been there for 6 months. Some for a year. Recovery was slow. Many soldiers never fully recovered. They learned to manage their symptoms. But the symptoms never truly disappeared. The nightmares. The anxiety. The sudden panic. These became permanent features of their lives. Morrison met other soldiers with similar stories. Private Thomas Grant had stopped speaking after watching his squad get killed by artillery. He communicated only through writing. Corporal Daniel Hughes trembled constantly. His hands shook so violently he could not hold a cup without spilling. Sergeant William Foster had night terrors. He would wake screaming, thrashing, convinced he was under attack. These men had all broken. Each in a different way. Each carrying invisible wounds. The staff psychiatrist at the 95th General Hospital was Major Robert Klein. He was 52 years old. Professor of psychiatry at Harvard before the war. He had been studying combat fatigue since 1943. He had published papers on the condition. He understood it better than most military physicians. But even Klein admitted there was much they did not know. Why did some soldiers break while others did not? Why did trauma manifest in such different ways? Why did some men recover while others remained broken? Klein reviewed Morrison's case. He noted the unusual symptom presentation. He was intrigued. He asked permission to include Morrison in a research study on combat fatigue. Morrison agreed. He had nothing to lose. Klein conducted extensive interviews. He used Morrison's case to explore the mechanisms of psychological breakdown. The findings would be published after the war. Morrison would become case study number 37 in Klein's influential paper on combat-related neurological disorders. By March 1945, Morrison's laughter had become rare. Perhaps once per day. Sometimes less. He could speak normally most of the time. He could eat. He could sleep. But he remained deeply depressed. He felt he had failed. Failed his unit. Failed his country. Failed himself. Klein diagnosed Morrison with severe depression secondary to combat trauma. A dual diagnosis. The laughter was healing. But the underlying trauma remained. Klein recommended Morrison be discharged from military service. Medical discharge. Unfit for duty. Morrison would receive disability benefits. But he would carry the stigma of psychiatric discharge for the rest of his life. In 1945, that stigma was profound. Mental illness was shameful. Hidden. Not discussed. Soldiers who broke were seen as weak. Lesser. Morrison would go home. But home would not be the same. He would not be the same. On April 12, 1945, Private First Class Robert Morrison was formally separated from military service. The discharge papers listed the reason as psychoneurosis, severe, manifested by emotional instability. The Army classified the discharge as medical. Not dishonorable. But not honorable either. The distinction was important. An honorable discharge meant you had served well and completed your duty. A medical discharge meant you had broken. Morrison read the papers. He sighed. He felt nothing. The laughter had almost stopped. It still emerged occasionally, usually triggered by stress. Once when Morrison was filling out discharge paperwork, he began laughing. The clerk looked at him strangely. Morrison could not explain. He just took the papers and left. The laughter lasted 30 seconds. Then stopped. This was his new reality. The symptom would never fully disappear. It would always be there, waiting. Morrison returned to the United States aboard a hospital ship in late April. The voyage took 12 days. He shared a cabin with 3 other psychiatric casualties. None of them talked much. They spent the journey in silence, smoking cigarettes, staring at the ocean. Each man trapped in his own thoughts, his own memories, his own private war that would never end. The ship docked in New York on May 3, 1945. 3 days before Germany surrendered. Morrison had missed the end of the war in Europe by less than a week. He felt cheated. He had survived Normandy, had fought through France, had endured the Hürtgen Forest. But he had not seen victory. He had broken before the finish. This thought tormented him. Morrison took a train to Columbus, Ohio. His parents met him at the station. His mother cried. His father shook his hand. They asked if he was injured. Morrison said no. Not in a way they could see. They did not understand. How could they? Morrison did not explain. He carried his duffel bag to their car. Rode home in silence. The city looked the same. The house looked the same. But Morrison had changed. Fundamentally. Irrevocably. The first night home, Morrison's father asked about the war. Asked what Morrison had done. Morrison tried to answer. He made it through 2 sentences. Then he started laughing. His parents stared. Confused. Frightened. Morrison tried to stop. Could not. The laughter lasted 40 seconds. When it ended, Morrison went upstairs to his room. He did not come down for dinner. His mother stood outside his door. She heard him crying. She did not know what to do. In the weeks that followed, Morrison struggled to adjust. He could not sleep through the night. Dreams of the Hürtgen Forest woke him. The machine gun. The depression. The rain. He would wake gasping. His sheets soaked with sweat. He tried to explain to his parents. They listened. But they could not truly understand. They had not been there. They had not felt the terror. The waiting. The certainty of death. Their sympathy was genuine. But it was not enough. Morrison's father suggested he look for work. Said staying busy would help. Morrison visited several factories. Applied for jobs. The interviews went poorly. Employers asked about his military service. Morrison explained he had been discharged for medical reasons. They asked what kind of injury. Morrison said it was psychological. Their expressions changed. Sympathy turned to suspicion. They said they would call if something opened up. They never called. The stigma followed Morrison everywhere. His neighbors knew he had been discharged. Word spread. People whispered. Some said he had faked shell shock to get sent home. Others said he had lost his mind. Both versions cast him as weak. Unreliable. Not the kind of man you wanted to hire. Not the kind of man you wanted your daughter dating. Not the kind of man who belonged in polite society. By June 1945, Morrison stopped leaving the house. He spent his days in his room. Reading. Smoking. Thinking. His mother brought him meals. He ate little. He lost more weight. His father became frustrated. He had fought in World War I. He had seen combat at Belleau Wood. He had come home. He had rebuilt his life. Why couldn't Morrison do the same? He did not understand that World War II combat was different. More intense. More sustained. The human mind could only endure so much. In July, Morrison began drinking. His father kept whiskey in a cabinet in the dining room. Morrison started with 1 glass in the evening. Then 2. Then 3. The alcohol numbed the memories. Dulled the anxiety. When he was drunk, he did not think about the forest. Did not hear the machine gun. Did not see Wright's body. The whiskey became his medication. More effective than the army's sedatives. And available without a doctor's supervision. His mother noticed. She confronted Morrison. Asked him to stop. Morrison said he would try. He did not try. The drinking continued. Worsened. By August, Morrison was drinking during the day. His father threatened to throw him out. Morrison said that was fine. He would leave. But he did not leave. He had nowhere to go. No money. No prospects. He was trapped. In his parents' house. In his own mind. In the aftermath of a war that had destroyed him. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The war was over. Celebrations erupted across America. Morrison heard fireworks. Shouting. People dancing in the streets. He stayed in his room. The celebration felt obscene. Men had died. Thousands. Tens of thousands. The cost had been immense. And here people were dancing. As if the suffering had not mattered. As if the dead could be forgotten because victory had been achieved. Morrison's depression deepened. He stopped responding when his parents spoke to him. He sat in his room for hours without moving. Sometimes he would laugh suddenly. For no reason. The sound terrified his mother. She did not know how to help. She contacted the Veterans Administration. Asked about psychiatric services. She was told there was a waiting list. 6 months. Maybe longer. Demand was high. Thousands of soldiers needed treatment. Resources were limited. In September, Morrison made his first suicide attempt. He swallowed half a bottle of his mother's sleeping pills. His father found him unconscious on his bedroom floor. Called an ambulance. Morrison's stomach was pumped at the hospital. He survived. When he woke, a psychiatrist asked why he had done it. Morrison said he could not live with the memories. Could not live with the shame. Could not live as a broken man. The psychiatrist recommended inpatient psychiatric care. Morrison refused. He would not go to an asylum. Would not be locked up like an animal. He was released after 3 days. The hospital notified his parents. Gave them a list of warning signs. Told them to watch Morrison closely. His mother quit her job at the department store. She stayed home to monitor him. She removed all medications from the house. Locked the liquor cabinet. Watched Morrison constantly. It was exhausting. For both of them. Morrison resented the surveillance. His mother feared what would happen if she stopped. October brought the first anniversary of Morrison's breakdown. 1 year since the Hürtgen Forest. 1 year since he had lain in that depression waiting to die. The date haunted him. He thought about Wright. About Davis. About the other men from his company who had not survived. He thought about how he had survived. But not really. His body had lived. But something essential had died. His sense of self. His ability to function. His belief that he had value. On October 12, Morrison's father had a heart attack. He collapsed at work. Died before the ambulance arrived. 53 years old. Morrison's mother was devastated. Morrison felt nothing. Guilt about feeling nothing. But still nothing. He could not mourn. Could not comfort his mother. Could not be the son she needed. He was hollow. Empty. A shell. His father's death was just another loss in a long series of losses that had started in the Hürtgen Forest and would never end. The funeral was November 2nd. Friends and family gathered. Morrison stood beside his mother at the graveside. He did not cry. He stared at the casket. People spoke to him. Offered condolences. He nodded. Said nothing. One uncle asked how Morrison was doing. Morrison tried to answer. He laughed instead. A short burst. 5 seconds. The uncle looked disturbed. Walked away. Morrison did not try to explain. After the funeral, Morrison's mother sold the house. She could not afford it alone. She moved to a small apartment across town. Morrison went with her. 2 rooms. 1 bedroom. Morrison slept on the couch. The apartment was cramped. Suffocating. Morrison felt like a burden. His mother insisted he was not. But he knew the truth. He was a broken son who could not care for himself. A reminder of a war that had taken everything from their family. December 1945. Morrison had been home for 7 months. Nothing had improved. The laughter was less frequent. But the depression remained. The nightmares continued. The drinking persisted. His mother watched helplessly as her son deteriorated. She had no resources. No knowledge. No support system. The Veterans Administration waiting list was still 6 months long. Morrison refused to seek private psychiatric help. He did not trust doctors. Did not believe anyone could help him. He had given up. Then, on December 18th, something unexpected happened. Morrison received a letter. It was from Corporal Daniel Hughes. The soldier Morrison had met at the psychiatric hospital in England. Hughes had been discharged in September. He was living in Philadelphia. He had heard about support groups for veterans struggling with combat fatigue. Groups where men could talk about their experiences, share their struggles, help each other cope. Hughes wrote that he was attending one such group. It was helping. He thought Morrison might benefit. He included the address. Morrison read the letter 3 times. He was skeptical. Talking to other broken men would not fix anything. But he was also desperate. 7 months of isolation had taught him that he could not heal alone. Maybe talking would help. Maybe shared misery was better than solitary misery. He decided to try. What? If it was useless, he would never go back. The support group met in the basement of a church in downtown Columbus. Morrison attended on January 8, 1946. 15 men were present. All veterans. All struggling with combat trauma. Some had been home for months. Others for more than a year. They sat in a circle. A civilian psychiatrist, Dr. Arthur Brennan, facilitated. Brennan was volunteer. He had studied combat fatigue during the war. He understood these men's struggles better than most doctors. Brennan explained the rules. No judgment. No shame. What was said in the room stayed in the room. Each man could speak or remain silent. The goal was not to fix anyone. The goal was to create a space where suffering could be shared. Where men did not have to pretend to be strong. Where weakness was not seen as failure. This was radical in 1946. Mental illness was still stigmatized. Men were expected to be tough. To endure. To never break. The first man to speak was a former Marine. He had fought at Iwo Jima. He described watching his best friend die beside him. Said he felt guilty for surviving. Said he could not stop thinking about it. The guilt was consuming him. He started crying. No one judged. Several men nodded. They understood. Morrison listened. The Marine's story was different from his. But the emotion was the same. The guilt, the shame, the inability to move forward. One by one, other men shared their stories. A soldier who had nightmares every night. A sailor who could not stand loud noises. A pilot who had survivor's guilt after his crew died in a crash. Each story was unique, but the pattern was consistent. War had broken these men. Society expected them to heal quickly. But they could not. The wounds were too deep, too complex, too invisible. When it was Morrison's turn, he hesitated. He had never talked about December 2nd. Not in detail. Not to anyone who understood. He took a breath. He began to speak. He described the Hürtgen Forest, the machine gun, the depression, the 4 hours of waiting. He described Wright dying, Davis screaming, the fear that never ended. He described the laughter that came later, how it had consumed him, how he could not control it, how it made him feel insane. As Morrison spoke, he started laughing. Not because anything was funny. The laughter was involuntary, a reflex. But this time Morrison did not stop speaking. He pushed through it. He described the shame, the stigma, the failed job interviews, the suicide attempt, his father's death, his mother's exhaustion, his own sense of being fundamentally broken beyond repair. The words poured out, between the laughter, through the laughter. Morrison spoke for 15 minutes. When he finished, the room was silent. Then one man said, "Thank you for sharing." Others nodded. Brennan asked Morrison how he felt. Morrison said exhausted, but also lighter, as if some weight had been lifted. Not gone, just lighter. Brennan explained that trauma thrived in silence. When kept hidden, it grew stronger. When spoken aloud, it lost some of its power. Not all, but some. This was the beginning of healing. Morrison attended the group every week. Sometimes he spoke. Sometimes he just listened. Both were valuable. He learned that he was not alone. That other men struggled with similar demons. That breaking under impossible pressure was not a moral failure. It was a human response to inhuman conditions. This realization changed something in Morrison. He began to see himself differently. Not as a coward. Not as a failure. As a wounded man trying to heal. By February, Morrison's laughter had decreased significantly. Stress still triggered it occasionally. But the episodes were brief. Manageable. Morrison realized that talking about the trauma was therapy. Each time he shared his story, the memories lost some of their power. The machine gun became less terrifying. Wright's death became less haunting. The guilt became bearable. This was not cure. But it was progress. In March, Morrison decided to look for work again. This time he was honest. He told potential employers about his combat experience. About his psychiatric discharge. About his ongoing recovery. Most employers still rejected him. But one did not. A small printing company needed a clerk. The owner, Mr. William Jacobs, was a World War I veteran. He understood combat trauma. He had seen men break after below wood. He gave Morrison a chance. Morrison started work on March 15th. It was a small step. But it was forward motion. The job was simple. Filing. Organizing. Light bookkeeping. Morrison worked 4 hours per day. That was all he could manage. Longer shifts triggered anxiety. But 4 hours was sustainable. He earned enough to contribute to rent. His mother was relieved. Not because of the money. Because Morrison was engaged. Active. Trying. That was more important than the paycheck. Morrison continued attending the support group. He became one of the regular members. Other veterans started seeking his advice. He had been broken. He was healing. That journey gave him credibility. He could speak from experience. He could offer hope. Not empty platitudes. Real hope based on real progress. Morrison began to see purpose in his suffering. If his experience could help others, perhaps it had meaning. By May 1946, Morrison had regained 30 pounds. He looked healthier. His mother noticed. She said he seemed more like himself. Morrison disagreed. He said he was not the same person who had left for war. That person was gone. But he was becoming someone new. Someone who had been broken and reassembled. The cracks were still visible. But they held. This new Morrison was different. Less naive. More aware of darkness. But also more resilient. He had survived the worst. He could survive anything now. But recovery was not linear. On June 14, 1946, Morrison had a severe setback. A car backfired on the street outside the print shop. The sound was sharp, loud, unexpected. Morrison's body reacted before his mind could process. He dove under his desk, covered his head. His heart pounded. He could not breathe. He was back in the Hürtgen Forest. The machine gun was firing. Wright was dying. Morrison was trapped. The terror was total. His co-workers found him under the desk, trembling, sweating, laughing. The laughter had returned with full intensity. Morrison could not control it, could not explain. His boss called his mother. She came to bring Morrison home. Morrison laughed the entire drive. His mother said nothing. She just drove. She had learned that words did not help during these episodes. Only time. Only waiting. The episode lasted 3 hours. Morrison spent the rest of the day in bed. Exhausted. Ashamed. He thought he had been improving. Thought he had control. But one unexpected sound had shattered his progress. He felt defeated. Dr. Brennan called that evening. Morrison's mother had contacted him. Brennan explained that setbacks were normal. Recovery was not a straight line. It was cycles. Progress. Regression. More progress. The regression did not erase the progress. It was part of the healing process. Morrison returned to work the next day. His co-workers said nothing. Either they did not know what to say or they were afraid. Morrison did not explain. He just worked. Filed papers. Organized documents. Tried to act normal. But he felt fragile. One loud noise had broken him. What if it happened again? What if he could never be truly stable? What if he was fundamentally too damaged to function in normal society? These questions haunted Morrison for weeks. His attendance at the support group became irregular. Some weeks he went. Other weeks he could not face it. He started drinking again. Not heavily. Just 1 or 2 glasses in the evening. To quiet the anxiety. To dull the fear. To make sleep possible. His mother noticed. Said nothing. She was tired of fighting. Tired of worrying. She let Morrison manage his own coping mechanisms. Even the destructive ones. July brought another challenge. The Veterans Administration finally had an opening for psychiatric treatment. Morrison was offered a spot in an intensive outpatient program. 6 weeks. 5 days per week. Group therapy. Individual therapy. Psychiatric medication management. The program was comprehensive. Evidence-based. Morrison's mother urged him to go. Said it could help. Morrison refused. He did not trust institutional psychiatry. He remembered the electroshock treatments. The forced sedation. The storage tent. He would not put himself in that position again. Brennan tried to convince Morrison. Explained that the VA program was different. More humane. More effective. Based on new understanding of combat trauma. But Morrison remained adamant. He would continue with the support group. That was enough. Brennan worried. He believed Morrison needed more intensive treatment. But he could not force it. Morrison had to choose his own path. Even if that path was suboptimal. By August, Morrison's relationship with his mother was deteriorating. They lived in close quarters. The apartment was small. Morrison's moods were unpredictable. Some days he was functional. Helpful. Other days he was withdrawn. Angry. His mother tried to be patient. But she was human. She had limits. On August 23rd they had a major argument. Morrison's mother said he was not trying hard enough. Said he was using his trauma as an excuse. Said he needed to take responsibility for his recovery. Morrison exploded. He said she did not understand. She had not been in the forest. She had not waited to die. She had not broken. She had no right to judge. His mother cried. Said she was trying to help. Morrison said her help felt like judgment. He left the apartment. Walked for hours. Thought about leaving. Going somewhere else. Starting over. But he had no money. No plan. No energy. He returned home at midnight. His mother was asleep. They did not speak the next morning. September marked 2 years since the Hürtgen Forest. The anniversary affected Morrison deeply. He took the day off work. Stayed in the apartment. Thought about Wright. About Davis. About what might have been different if the machine gun had not been there. If the artillery had destroyed the bunker. If Morrison had died instead of Wright. These counterfactuals tormented him. History could not be changed. But Morrison could not stop imagining alternatives. That night, Morrison attended the support group. He was quiet. Did not share. Just listened. After the meeting, Brennan pulled him aside. Asked if Morrison was okay. Morrison said no. He was not okay. He was tired. Tired of struggling. Tired of pretending he could rebuild a normal life. Tired of disappointing everyone. Brennan listened. Did not offer platitudes. Just said Morrison was not alone. Said the struggle was real. Said giving up was not the answer even when it seemed like the only option. Morrison went home. His mother was waiting. She apologized for the argument in August. Said she loved him. Said she was scared of losing him. Morrison said he was scared too. Scared he would never heal. Scared the war would define him forever. They talked for an hour. It was the most honest conversation they had had since Morrison returned home. It did not solve anything. But it created connection. And connection was what Morrison needed most. October brought a small improvement. Morrison's work hours increased to 6 per day. He was handling the responsibility better. The routine was stabilizing. He still had bad days. But the good days were becoming more frequent. His boss noticed. Said Morrison was becoming reliable. That meant something. In a world where Morrison felt worthless, being reliable gave him purpose. Small purpose, but enough to keep going. In November, Morrison met a woman named Ruth at a church social. His mother had convinced him to attend. Morrison was reluctant, but he went. Ruth worked as a secretary at a law firm. She was 25. Quiet. Kind. They talked for 30 minutes. Morrison did not mention the war. Mentioned the work. Books. Music. Normal things. Ruth seemed interested. She asked if Morrison wanted to meet for coffee. Morrison said yes. Surprised himself. The coffee date went well. Morrison was nervous. Worried he would laugh inappropriately. But he did not. They talked for 2 hours. Ruth asked about Morrison's military service. Morrison gave a brief answer. Said he had been in Europe. Said it was difficult. Did not elaborate. Ruth did not press. She seemed to understand that some things were better left unspoken. They planned a second date. Morrison felt something he had not felt in years. Hope. By December 1946, Morrison had been dating Ruth for 5 weeks. The relationship was tentative. Fragile. But it was real. Ruth knew Morrison was struggling. She did not know the details. But she saw the signs. The nightmares. The sudden fear. The occasional laughter at inappropriate moments. She did not judge. She accepted. That acceptance was healing in itself. Morrison began to believe he could have a future. Not the future he had imagined before the war. But a different future. A smaller, quieter life. But a life nonetheless. On Christmas Eve, Morrison attended midnight service with Ruth and his mother. The church was decorated. Candles. Pine boughs. The service included prayers for soldiers who had not returned home. Morrison thought about Wright. About Davis. About the thousands of others. He did not cry. But he felt something. Grief. Gratitude. Both. He had survived. They had not. That was not fair. But it was reality. Morrison was learning to live with unfairness. To accept what could not be changed. 1947 began with momentum. Morrison proposed to Ruth on February 14th. She said yes. They planned a small wedding for June. Morrison's mother was overjoyed. She had worried Morrison would never have a normal life. The engagement suggested otherwise. Maybe Morrison could rebuild. Maybe the war did not have to define everything. Maybe healing was possible after all. The support group celebrated Morrison's engagement. The men saw it as validation. If Morrison could find love after what he had endured, perhaps they could too. Perhaps their brokenness was not permanent. Perhaps they could reclaim pieces of the lives they had lost. Morrison became a symbol. Not of cure. But of survival. Of perseverance. Of the possibility that men damaged by war could still build meaningful futures. The wedding took place on June 7, 1947. Exactly 3 years after D-Day. Morrison chose the date intentionally. He wanted to transform the anniversary. To create a positive memory associated with that time. 50 people attended. Friends. Family. Fellow veterans from the support group. Dr. Brennan was there. He had become a mentor to Morrison. More than a therapist. A guide through the wilderness of trauma. Morrison and Ruth honeymooned for 3 days at a cabin in Ohio. Nothing extravagant. They could not afford more. But it was peaceful. Quiet. Morrison slept better there than he had in years. Away from the city. Away from loud noises. Away from reminders. He and Ruth talked about the future. They wanted children. A house. Stability. Normal dreams. Morrison wondered if he could achieve them. Ruth said they would try. Together. That was what mattered. After the wedding, Morrison and Ruth rented a small house on the edge of Columbus. 2 bedrooms. A yard. Morrison planted a garden. Tomatoes. Lettuce. Working with soil was therapeutic. It gave him something to nurture. Something to care for. Something that grew instead of dying. The garden became Morrison's meditation. Every evening he spent an hour tending the plants. It calmed his mind. Reduced the anxiety. Provided structure. By 1948, Morrison's life had stabilized. He was working full-time at the print shop. He had been promoted to assistant manager. He was attending the support group monthly instead of weekly. He still had nightmares. Still had moments of anxiety. Still laughed occasionally at inappropriate times. But these symptoms were manageable. They no longer dominated his life. They were scars. Visible reminders of the past. But they did not prevent him from functioning. Ruth became pregnant in September 1948. Morrison was terrified. He worried he would be a bad father. Worried his trauma would damage his child. Worried he was too broken to provide the stability a child needed. Ruth assured him he would be fine. Said his awareness of his limitations made him more careful. More thoughtful. Better than fathers who believed they had no flaws. Morrison wanted to believe her. He tried. Their son, James Robert Morrison, was born on May 15, 1949. 7 pounds, 3 ounces. Healthy. When Morrison held James for the first time, he cried. Not from fear. From joy. From relief. From the realization that life continued. That the war had not destroyed everything. That new generations could be born free from the horrors he had witnessed. James represented hope. Morrison committed to being the father James deserved. Fatherhood changed Morrison. He stopped drinking entirely. He became more disciplined about managing his symptoms. He could not afford to collapse. James depended on him. Morrison attended therapy more regularly. Took medication as prescribed. Practiced coping strategies. The responsibility of parenthood gave him purpose beyond survival. He was not just trying to get through the day. He was building a life for his son. By 1950, Morrison was functional. Not cured. Never cured. But functional. He worked. He provided for his family. He was a present father. A supportive husband. A valued member of the community. People who met Morrison in 1950 would not have guessed what he had endured. The external scars had faded. The internal scars remained. But they were private. Hidden. Morrison had learned to carry them without letting them crush him. He still thought about the Hürtgen Forest. Still thought about Wright and Davis. Still wondered why he had survived when they had not. Survivor's guilt was permanent. But Morrison had learned to channel it. He volunteered with veterans organizations. He mentored younger veterans struggling with combat trauma. He shared his story. Not because it was easy. Because it was necessary. Because silence had nearly killed him. And speaking had saved him. In 1952, Dr. Arthur Brennan published a comprehensive study on combat fatigue. The study included data from 240 World War II veterans. Morrison was case study 37. The study documented various manifestations of combat trauma. Nightmares. Tremors. Mutism. And pathological laughter. Morrison's case was highlighted as particularly unusual. Brennan's study concluded that combat fatigue was a legitimate neurological and psychological condition. That it was not cowardice. Not weakness. But injury. Invisible injury. But injury nonetheless. The study had limited impact initially. In the 1950s, mental illness remained stigmatized. Veterans with psychiatric discharges were still viewed with suspicion. Society preferred to celebrate heroic soldiers. Not broken ones. But the study laid groundwork. It provided evidence. Documented cases. It became reference material for future researchers studying combat trauma. The work Morrison and 239 other veterans contributed would eventually help change medical understanding of psychological wounds. Morrison continued working at the print shop through the 1950s. He never fully recovered. The nightmares persisted. The startle response remained. Loud noises still triggered anxiety. But these symptoms became background. Manageable. Part of his life. Not the defining feature. He learned to live with them. Like a person with chronic pain learns to function despite discomfort. The pain does not disappear. But it becomes familiar. Tolerable. Ruth remained Morrison's anchor. She understood his struggles. She did not expect perfection. She accepted him as he was. Broken in places. Functional in others. Their marriage was not perfect. No marriages. But it was strong. Built on honesty. On acceptance. On commitment to weather difficulties together. Ruth gave Morrison what he needed most. Unconditional acceptance. The knowledge that he did not have to hide his wounds. That he could be broken and still be loved. James grew up aware that his father was different. Morrison never hid his history. He explained age appropriately. Said he had been a soldier. Said war had been difficult. Said some experiences left permanent marks. James understood. He saw his father's nightmares. Heard the occasional inappropriate laughter. But he also saw his father's strength. His determination. His commitment to family. James learned that broken did not mean worthless. That wounded men could still be good fathers. That trauma did not erase humanity. In 1965, the United States escalated involvement in Vietnam. Morrison watched young men deploy. He felt sick. He knew what awaited them. The psychological cost. The invisible wounds. He knew many would return broken. He knew society would not understand. He knew the cycle would repeat. He wanted to warn them. But warnings were useless. Some lessons could only be learned through experience. Some wounds could only be understood by those who had been wounded. Morrison became active in veterans advocacy. He testified before Congress in 1968 about the need for improved psychiatric services for combat veterans. He described his own experience. The laughter. The stigma. The suicide attempt. The long recovery. He argued that the government had a moral obligation to treat psychological wounds as seriously as physical ones. His testimony was powerful. But change was slow. The military remained reluctant to acknowledge psychiatric casualties. Admission suggested weakness. Institutional weakness. That was unacceptable. By 1970, Morrison had grandchildren. James married. Had 2 daughters. Morrison was a doting grandfather. He told them stories. Not about war. About childhood. About Columbus before the Depression. About simpler times. His granddaughters knew Grandpa had been a soldier. But they did not know the details. They did not need to. Morrison's war was over. He carried it silently. Let them experience innocence. Let them grow up without the shadow of the Hürtgen Forest. Morrison retired from the print shop in 1975. He was 53 years old. His boss, William Jacobs, had died. The new owner did not understand Morrison's limitations, did not accommodate the occasional episodes, suggested Morrison retire early. Morrison agreed. He was tired. He had worked for 29 years while managing severe psychological trauma. That was enough. He had earned rest. Retirement was difficult. Structure had been Morrison's stability. Without work, the days stretched endlessly. The nightmares increased. The anxiety worsened. Ruth suggested Morrison volunteer. Find purpose outside employment. Morrison began volunteering at a VA hospital. He visited psychiatric wards, talked to young veterans returning from Vietnam, shared his story, offered hope. The work was painful. Every veteran reminded Morrison of himself. Young, broken, ashamed. But the work was also meaningful. Morrison could offer what he had lacked in 1944. Understanding, acceptance, proof that survival was possible. In 1980, the American Psychiatric Association officially recognized post-traumatic stress disorder in the DSM-3. This was revolutionary. For the first time, psychological trauma from combat was classified as a legitimate medical condition with specific diagnostic criteria. Morrison read about PTSD. He recognized his symptoms. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the intrusive memories, the emotional numbing. He had been living with PTSD for 36 years. But only now did it have a name. Only now was it officially recognized as real. The recognition came too late for Morrison. He had already fought his battle. Already learned to manage without institutional support. But the recognition mattered for future veterans. It meant they might receive treatment earlier. Might avoid the stigma Morrison had endured. Might not have to fight alone for decades. This was progress. Slow. Insufficient. But progress nonetheless. Morrison continued volunteering through the 1980s. He became a fixture at the VA hospital. Staff recognized him. Veterans sought him out. He had credibility. He had survived. He had built a life. He proved recovery was possible. Not easy. Not complete. But possible. That message was powerful. It gave men hope when hope seemed impossible. Morrison's suffering had been transformed into purpose. The transformation did not erase the suffering. But it gave meaning to it. In 1989, Morrison attended a reunion of the 22nd Infantry Regiment. It was the 45th anniversary of D-Day. 87 veterans gathered. They were old now. Gray-haired. Some used walkers. Some had hearing aids. They shared memories, laughed at old jokes, toasted fallen comrades. Morrison attended with mixed feelings. He felt connected to these men. They had shared the war. But he also felt separate. His breakdown had isolated him. He was the one who had failed. The one who had not made it to the end. During the reunion, Morrison met Captain James Hartley. Hartley had been Morrison's company commander. He was 72 now. Retired colonel. They had not seen each other since December 1944. Hartley remembered Morrison. Remembered the letter he had written. Remembered the doubt. Hartley apologized. Said he had not understood combat fatigue. Said he had judged Morrison unfairly. Said Morrison had been a good soldier who had been pushed beyond human limits. Morrison accepted the apology. It meant something. Not healing. But acknowledgement. Recognition that his breakdown had not been moral failure. Ruth died in 1992. Cancer. 69 years old. Morrison was devastated. Ruth had been his anchor for 46 years. Without her, he was untethered. The nightmares worsened. The depression returned. For the first time in decades, Morrison considered suicide again. But he did not act. He had grandchildren. He had James. He had responsibilities. He had survived the Hürtgen Forest. He had survived the laughter. He had survived 48 years of PTSD. He would survive Ruth's death too. Not because he wanted to. Because he had to. Morrison lived another 12 years. He died on November 7, 2004. 82 years old. Heart failure. James was with him. Morrison's last words were, "Tell them it was real." He meant the war. The trauma. The laughter. The decades of struggling. He wanted people to know. To remember. That psychological wounds were real. That they lasted. That they mattered. James fulfilled his father's request. At Morrison's funeral, he described his father's war. The Hürtgen Forest. The pathological laughter. The long recovery. The lifelong struggle with PTSD. The courage it took to survive invisible wounds. James did not glorify. Did not dramatize. He simply told the truth. That his father had been broken by war. That he had spent 60 years healing. That he had never fully recovered. But that he had built a meaningful life nonetheless. Morrison's story represents thousands of similar stories. Soldiers who broke under combat stress, who developed unusual symptoms, who struggled to rebuild lives in the aftermath, who faced stigma, disbelief, judgment. Morrison's pathological laughter was rare, but his struggle was common. Millions of veterans have lived with invisible wounds, have carried trauma silently, have survived year after year despite psychological damage. The medical understanding of combat trauma has improved since Morrison's time. PTSD is now recognized. Treatment is available. But challenges remain. Veterans still face stigma, still struggle to access care, still carry invisible wounds that society does not fully understand. Morrison's legacy is a reminder that psychological wounds are real, that they require treatment, that soldiers who break under impossible pressure are not weak. They are wounded, and wounds deserve care. Always.